Hi, so my name's Jaye Gould, and for the last 5 years I've been studying medical herbalism. I started as a doula and birth supporter. I've been in the maternity world, should we say, for the last 11 years since my daughter was born. And I have supported many couples and families throughout their childbearing year. And one of the things that was becoming more and more apparent was the number of questions that I was receiving around the use of herbs in pregnancy, labour and childbirth, and for the postpartum time afterwards. And I suddenly thought this was something that I should really start investigating a little bit more and researching. And so I decided that I would enroll on a foundational herbal medicine course, and then found that my interest just flourished. This was around about the sort of beginning of 2020, and obviously with things rolling out as they did throughout the rest of 2020, it became quite apparent to me that alternative forms of medicine and routes towards keeping ourselves healthy was becoming more and more important, particularly where our wonderful herbal allies came in. One of the things that really sparked my interest was around the elements of immunity and the underlying causes and sort of supporting of our overall immune health. And the more and more I delved into that side of my herbal research, the more and more I became aware that the way that we've used herbs, even though the manner of their delivery might have changed over the years, that the herbs that we've been using have largely stayed the same for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we have this absolutely outstanding long tradition of herbal medicine in Britain to be able to draw on. And so as my practice went on, I became more and more interested in the history of herbal medicine, and particularly the use of folk medicine and traditional healing. Perhaps part of that was born out of the interest around women's wisdom and childbirth and things like that as well. But the more and more I became familiar with the herbs that I was using to support people during their childbearing year, the more I could see that this was a long-standing tradition of using herbs that went back through countless generations. And the wisdom that brought it into the modern era was largely won through the oral tradition. And in my most recent investigations and my study of research at the moment with historical herbalism, I'm focusing at the moment on 18th century folk medicines in Scotland.
Well, that's very interesting. I think one of the questions I've got for you, Jay, is are people receptive to herbal medicines today when we've been so used to this Western style of a pill that will cure the symptom? How did you find people reacted to being given a herb instead of a pill?
Well, I think one of the things that is important to remember is that all medicine started out as a plant, a leaf, a root, a seed, a tree, and that our original medicines were given to us by nature. The way that our brains and our bodies work for the receptibility of modern Western allopathic medicine, it can only do that because of the lock and key mechanism, if you like, between how our bodies have evolved and co-evolved beside plants that answer that particular need. So when people are given a medicine by the doctor or given a prescription by the doctor, nowadays we become very used to this quick fix. And one of the things that herbal medicine does very well is treat long-term chronic conditions rather than this sort of sudden acute kind of onset of conditions. That's not to say that herbal medicine and plant medicine can't, cure a sudden headache or, look after a bruise or something like that. But for the most part, people are becoming more and more aware that for long-term chronic health conditions, things that can't always be looked after by long-term modern medicine, particularly ones that come along with side effects and whatnot too, that plant medicine is actually a lot more helpful to them in the long run. And so when somebody comes to see me as a client or asking for herbs in pregnancy, then the idea is that this is about building a relationship with plants. Now, we like to think that we can. One of the things I think is really interesting is that the right plants for the right people. Often we're trying to build this relationship between plants and people. And as a herbalist, we have the luxury of being able to look at the whole person. We can spend time with them, we can sit down and really delve into personal histories, medical histories, looking at the whole person as a holistic being. And so every single treatment we come up with for that person is going to be utterly unique to that individual. It isn't a one-size-fits-all policy like modern medicine. If you go into the doctor with a presenting complaint, you will get one of X number of medicines that are, prescribed for that condition, and usually the ones that that practice has a preference for as well. Whereas we have every single plant in our dispensary available to us, and other ones as well, even the ones that people have growing in their own gardens as well. And that's one of the things that I think is really appealing to people, is the fact that they can go out into their garden, into their woodland or parkland, and look for medicine that is tailor-made to them on their doorstep for gratis.
How would people be sure they're identifying the right plants, though? I mean, would there be some sort of educational learning needed for that? I mean, some of them could be quite obscure, couldn't they?
Absolutely. And this is where, if you have particular things that you're interested in pursuing as a healing modality, it's absolutely vital that people see a registered herbalist. But that said, with a good foraging course, a good book on plant identification, it's really easy to go out and start familiarizing yourself with things in your local environment. We know what a nettle is, and we know what a dandelion looks like. These are the sorts of things that even as children we're starting to learn. Oh, don't go near those plants. Those are the prickly, stingy plants. Pretty much most people know that what a nettle is. But most people don't know that a nettle is medicine as well. And we tend to be pulling up our dandelions in our garden because we get fed up with them, taking over. And, people don't like the fact that their seeds go everywhere. But actually, this is dandelion, which is one of the most valuable of my medicines, and one of the ones that I use in pretty much most prescriptions that I draw. Either the root, the leaf, sometimes the seed and the flower together as well as the tincture. But the root and the leaves are so incredibly useful, and people are just pulling them up and throwing them away. Wash them, stick them in your salads, make a cup of tea out the leaves. It's vital gut healing medicine. Not only do the roots provide amazing source of starch and polysaccharides for your gut flora, but the leaves act as a diuretic and a cleansing for your blood and your urinary tract. The whole plant is just wonderful, and I think it's probably one of my favourite plants to use, actually, and it's such a humble little thing.
Oh, you say you're interested in the 18th century herbalism, and would dandelion be one of the herbs that would have been well used back then?
Well, I certainly think in folk medicine particularly, people are using exactly what they can get their hands on. In Scotland in the 18th century, we're looking at two quite different spheres of medicine beginning to emerge. We're starting to see the onset of the more learned, trained doctoring and physicking like that, with the centres of learning like Edinburgh beginning to teach and educate doctors. But we also still see this long tradition of folk medicine, which tends to be particular to families. But there's also, obviously, because of this wide oral tradition, lots of people are sharing recipes, sharing remedies. And it tends to be, when we look into things like the household accounts, which usually were written by women or sort of the heads of the household, the chatelaines, when we look at some of the larger households. And we see some of these absolutely amazing plant remedies starting to be recorded and written down. Dandelion is one of those ones that, perhaps because of its being such a common usage, it becomes sort of lost amongst a lot of the other remedies and ingredients that are used in some of these medicines. But certainly dandelion, rose, nettle, all of these plants that would be growing wild and locally appear all over the place.
So this would have been a sort of a long verbal tradition then, would it, initially, on what herbs you would use or what flowers you could use for an ailment. And I suppose in later times they were finally written down.
Absolutely. This is one of the wonderful things about plants, is that the folk names for plants usually tells you what it's used for. So we have one of the ones that I particularly like here in Lanarkshire, excuse me, is we have coltsfoot, which I have on my shelf up here, which actually is, ironically, is very, very good for coughs and colds and chesty complaints. And its name is Tussilago, but here in Lanarkshire that had become corrupted to dishy lugs. And the idea that you've got these, like, lugs and Scots are your ears, so it's this idea that the plant is speaking to you in its particular language, telling you that it's what its uses are. We also look at things like elecampane as well, which is known as elf dock, because they thought it was very good for complaints or sort of hidden complaints that might have been used or might have been caused by elves shooting you with their little invisible arrows. When people had stitches in their side, stitchwort, which is one of the Galium family of goosegrasses and cleavers and chickweeds, and many other examples.
I've heard tell that there's meant to be, every plant out there is something that can help us as human beings or the animals. So there's, like, for every illness there's a cure in nature. Would you say that's correct?
I think there's a large possibility that the plants that are most available to us in our environment are the ones that are most suited to curing the ailments of the people in that locality. And that was one of the things that was noted in some of the 18th century herbals, is that the plants, particularly in Lanarkshire and Perthshire, the plants that were growing locally were the plants most used by the people for the most common ailments, which, being Scotland, nice, like, damp, cold conditions, tended to be respiratory disorders. And one of the recipes that I was going to share with you later on, which is a sort of a warming digestive bitters, which we can make into a tea, is one that combined local plants and plants that were becoming sort of more easily available through trade routes and connections with the Mediterranean, and the fact that as people were exploring into the New World as well and bringing things back here, bioregional sort of similarities between the places that people were exploring meant that they could bring plants over that would thrive over here as well. And that's one of the things that we do see a little bit more in the 18th century, is this inclusion of plants that were starting to venture in from further afield. If we look at some of the medieval remedies, we start to see plants that have come in from the continent as well. And so we tend to see lavenders and rosemaries and chamomiles and things like that, which now we think of as naturalized plants, but were actually being brought over from France and Italy and Spain, and the spices that would come up through the spice routes and the silk roads and things like that too. But when we're looking at folk medicine, we are looking at the plants that are growing outside people's doors. So we see the trees, we see rowan, we see ash, we see elder, we see lots of different sort of, our native species plants. And those are the trees and the plants that are now, when we look at them scientifically, we start to see that the reasons people were using them bear out to modern medicines and our sort of our modern way of thinking about things. And the way that the single extracts and single compounds that are pulled out of plants for particular remedies, like salicylic acid from willow, was originally from meadowsweet, and we use this now widely as a painkiller, but has been used as in its original form as meadowsweet for thousands of years. And things like lovely lemon balm as well, which we have, everybody's probably got lovely lemon balm growing in their garden. We know that that was intentionally farmed in the Neolithic, around about places like Zurich, what's now sort of modern Zurich in Switzerland, by the Stone Age people there. They were actually intentionally cultivating it. Now, whether they knew that it had medicinal properties or they valued it for its taste, or this wonderful crossover between food and medicine, that there's a long history of use of things being useful to people where they grow and the way that people are living with these plants.
What do you say back then in the 18th century or earlier? Would people have this knowledge themselves, or would they go to a healer?
Well, this is where we start to see this kind of divide. It depended very much on if you could afford to pay for somebody to come and see you, then you would probably be trying to find and secure the services of a learned doctor, a good doctor. But that depended on whether he could actually get out to see you. One of the problems with medicine, sort of disseminating medicine and healing to people in rural communities, was accessibility. And one of the things that we do see is the necessity for local people having their own wise women healers, local sort of knowledgeable people, because the big expensive city doctors just physically couldn't get to them. The roads weren't accessible. If it was in the middle of winter, everything was covered in sort of mud up to your knees. Horses and carriages weren't going to be able to make the journey across a lot of our rural landscape. Even where there were roads, most of them were in pretty poor condition back then. And so households and local people had their own community bases of knowledge and learning amongst the householders there. So yes, absolutely, there would be a few people within a given community who would be the midwives and the healers and the people who folk would go to, but they would probably be, there would be more of a bartering exchange between, I'll give you a pint of milk or a nice pat of butter or a leg of lamb when we fatten up the livestock, rather than paying silver coin for it. And certainly if we look towards the difference between the two herbals that I've been looking at most recently, we've got this wonderful herbal collection of herbal remedies written in the household accounts of the Mackenzie family, who were the Earls of Cromarty. And they are written in beautiful penmanship, obviously a very learned, educated hand. Everything's spelled beautifully, as one might expect from somebody with education behind them. And there is a combination of local knowledge as well as the idea that you might have to ask a doctor about this as well. But mostly we see this pool of this real resource, family resource. Now, whether this was only then used by this one particular family, this was their receipt book of recipes, of herbal remedies for themselves, and that was this knowledge disseminated into the community? It's difficult to say. But when we look at the lowland herbal, which by the wording of particularly terms like dishylugs for tussilago in it, seems to place it here in Lanarkshire. And in fact, we do know that there was quite a well thought of healer at Elsrickle, just about 6 miles away from here. And she was widely known to be quite the authority on herbal remedies and healing. And people would travel quite some distance to come and seek her wisdom.
That is interesting, because there was a time before that where anybody who had the art of healing with herbs or the like would have been perhaps thought of as a witch. So when did it become sort of acceptable to be the healer again in the 18th century? When before it was this, you had to be very careful, didn't you?
Well, we have to remember that witch trials were still going on and people were still being accused of witchcraft well into the 1700s as well. And certainly around here, there were quite a few women and men accused of witchcraft. Some sent to trial, some acquitted, some dismissed. But this was where folk healing started to adopt much more of a sort of Christianized over sort of glossing of things. So there would be a lot of charms would turn into prayers, the use of the cross or a crucifix or a rosary or something like that instead of perhaps a red thread or stones. We have this lovely, I often keep, I've got one up here, in the Scots tradition it was called a hectic stain, and it was a white precious stone. Now I suspect that locally a sort of a white stone is most likely to be quartz or a quartzite. And a lot of herbal remedies and a lot of healing was activated and intrinsically active through the use of this hectic stone, the hectic stain. Now, we start to see that kind of fading out of use in the sort of latter part of the 1600s and into the 1700s, when things start to become a little bit more, if you want to be taken seriously as a healer and probably not have a charge of witchcraft level at you, you want to start in incorporating prayers or more sort of references to Christ or to Virgin Mary. And so we see things like the Carmina Gadelica has this wonderful collection of charms which are transposed into this sort of prayer form, invoking Mary, invoking the name of Jesus. And so it starts to kind of legitimize what had previously been a sort of more magical folk healing practice to, a lot of the way that healing can happen is a good sell by the healer. And so often to be able to go, I'll send you away with this wee vial of sugar water and herbs in it. Now that will do you good, but if you add an extra prayer or a charm or something that really sort of speaks to the emotional, spiritual element of healing to people, then you're enabling it, you're activating it, you're giving it that oomph that is required for that person to really truly believe that this thing is going to help them.
Yeah, so it's like intention.
Absolutely, 100%.
With intention, yes, the healing. Would you say people today are seeking herbal medicines more than they used to?
I think the interest in herbal medicine has always been there, but it definitely seems to have been in the last sort of 4 or 5 years that people have started to look we start to look elsewhere for more alternative therapies and remedies. But really, I think sometimes people are aware that these things have been there all along, and as they are rediscovering the benefit of using plant medicine. There's been a lot of interest in the herbal side of things, the historical herbal side of things that I've been doing. Because I think when we start to look at the longevity of herbal medicine and how it has supported people through the years, people remember, oh, actually, yeah, I do quite like a cup of herbal tea. I do find that quite relaxing. Or, oh, yeah, my granny used to go out in the garden, and if, it's like the dock leaf for the nettle sting. People remember that it's always been there. And so if you sort of finding something that sparks that interest for whatever it might be, it's like a good gardening program on TV. It's like the interest in Gardener's World when it re-aired when it was airing during COVID for a lot of people, returned them to that sense of connection with nature and gardening. And out of these sorts of things, people are suddenly realizing there's also this other level to interaction with the natural world. Not only can we go for a lovely walk in the woods or in the park or alongside the river, and it makes us feel better, but there's actually things there that we can interact with that will offer us healing in a much more personal way through plant medicine. And so I think, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, yes, people are sort of rediscovering this amazing power of plants around them. And certainly I've been around here, I've been very lucky to be connected with a wonderful network of people who really enjoy being in connection with the natural world and have found that the not just the healing, but also the chance to really take control of their own health journeys as well has been something very valuable for them through the last few years.
So with your training as a medical herbalist, what got you interested into being a historical herbalist and to actually attend historical events?
Well, before I had my kids, I had trained as an archaeologist, and I've been working for Historic Scotland with built heritage as sort of environmental archaeology over at Melrose and Smailham Tower. And I've always been fascinated with sort of the history in the past. And since having my children, though, my career took a very different turn into birth work. But my interest in archaeology and anthropology and the history of sort of folk wisdom had always very much been there. And then with doing my studies in herbalism, it just felt like the more and more I was reading about the history of herbal medicine, the more and more I could see that there was this real sort of opportunity for introducing herbs and talking about and reintroducing herbs to people in a very different way. And my involvement really began back 2 years ago, I guess you could say, with a weekend that myself and a group of local artists as a collective put on, honouring the people accused of witchcraft in Tweeddale and the borders here. And we ran a weekend event, and a friend of mine who is also a lovely herbalist and chef, Nicola Orr, she and I devised an intuitive wild tea tasting event. And so we had 13 herbs for the 13 moons of the year, which we had previously been working with as part of our herbal connection group that Nicola started. And we brought together the 13 herbs, which included birch and rose and dandelion, nettle, hawthorn, lots of our sort of native plants. And we invited people to reconnect with them in a more personal way by mixing their own herbal tea. And out of that, because it was connected with this event honouring the people accused of witchcraft in the borders, I started becoming I started having this idea that perhaps we could situate herbs in more of a broader historical context. And so out of a conversation with Nicola and fellow herbalist Rox Madeira that she introduced me to, the three of us devised the idea of the Historical Herbalists, which was originally we were sort of looking at the medieval era because of that was the scope of the tea tasting around the time of the witch trials in Scotland. But then the more and more I was thinking about it, I thought, well, it doesn't have to be just the medieval herbalists. We could really be doing something much, much broader to show this continuity of use throughout the eras, because we look right back from the Paleolithic, from the Neolithic, we look to the Romano-British herbs, and we're coming through the Viking Age into the Iron Age, and then right up and through the Middle Ages. And plants have always been a constant for people, whether they're in cooking or they're being used for medicine. It's the one thing we can see when we look back at the archaeological record as well, is this continuity of herbs and plants, particularly in Britain. It's one of the things that is most useful to us as archaeologists, being able to really identify what is going on at a site as well, is to look at the soil samples and the palynology and really sort of see what is there, what's growing there, what people are eating, what are the burnt remains of foods and things like that. So one of the constants has always been plants for people. And historically, my real passion is sort of for the Middle Ages, but I have become really fascinated with Viking Age herbs. One of the things that I found very, very interesting was this use of native species herbs that we see on plants that are native to the UK, which now, with the expansion era in the Iron Age of the Viking Age people moving north, is taking our native species plants from Britain and Ireland up into Iceland when the first settlers took things there. And right up through Northern Europe as well, we share this wonderful sort of spread of similar plants and trees and things in the natural world that are helping people all through sort of Northern Europe. And when we look at the 18th century herbals, for example, we start to see this amazing, real kind of coalescing of all of this amazing knowledge. This is the standing on the shoulders of giants, of each generation, collating this wonderful knowledge. And then finally, particularly in the 18th century, we see the first of the amazing sort of herbals start to appear. And so I'm hoping that with the Historical Herbalists, we can continue this wonderful sort of interest in herbs, this continuity of herbs and herbal support for health throughout the years, and that things will just get more and more interesting for people as we move forward in future events as well. Each one that we do, each era that we portray, we have a different series of herbs and plants on the table. There will always be some constants because those are the plants that are here in our environment. But largely we see this sort of wonderful broadening and broadening and broadening of plants on offer to people. And when we get up into the 20th century, obviously now as modern British herbalists, we have this vast array of plants internationally available to us. So we have this amazing sort of, materia medica to draw on now. But most of the plants that I find work best for the people that I'm prescribing them for and that I'm working with are the native species plants that people have been growing up with, because familiarity breeds a certain comfort for some things. There's a wonderful facility in people being able to walk out of their back door into their garden and go, that will help me. That nettle, instead of pulling it up and sticking it on the compost heap, I'm going to pick the tops and make a tea. Or that they can walk through the woodland and identify 3 or 4 medicinal trees, which they may have walked past time after time previously. But now, instead of somebody going out and getting a prescription from a doctor or even from a herbalist, that they can walk out into their garden or their woodland and connect with the plants that are going to heal them.
So, being historical herbalists and in the 20th or 21st century, how do you see the three of you spreading the word in your events that you've got coming up?
Well, over the next, now we're going into the winter, we're looking at our winter warmers and our herbs and plants that are going to really boost our immunity over the dark end of the year. And we have an event coming up locally in which we will be making various different remedies for the winter season. I'll be doing a talk on mushrooms and adaptogenic mushrooms for immunity. And for the historical herbalists, we, into our events next year, our living history events probably kick off in the springtime when the weather gets a bit better. It's always nice to do things when the sun's shining. But we will be doing various different, again, right through the sort of the spread of the eras as well. So we have Viking Age events coming up. We have Scotland's Festival of History or the History in the Park, I should say, which will be up in St Andrews later on in the year, which I'll probably take the 18th century herbal to that, because that's the one that has captured my heart at the moment. But our living history events certainly, I think, are one of the nicest ways of getting our herbs into people's sort of psyche out there at the moment, because they're interactive. People can get their hands on the plants, they can smell them, they can touch them, they can see them, they can, all the different sort of activities that we offer as well. People can make teas, make infused oils or vinegars. We often have different sort of, pre-made up remedies for people to look at as well. And one of the things historically that I particularly enjoy is to make a bunch of historical remedies. Some are very weird and wacky and wonderful, and some involved all sorts of ingredients like fox poo and hare's brains and puppies and things like that we would never use now, but it's always interesting to talk about them, and for people to see that the plants themselves are the constants and that people can use them in so many different ways as well. So from tinctures and teas to salves and balms and things like that as well. There's lots of different ways of people being able to interact with them.
So people wouldn't have to have a vast medical knowledge. They could just perhaps nowadays pick a few of their favourite herbs and use them in cooking or in teas, couldn't they?
Absolutely. And this is, often people forget that they probably have a cupboard full of medicinal herbs at home. Every kitchen will have a herb cupboard or have a herb and spice rack. Most of the plants that are familiar to people have medicinal properties: parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, cinnamon, all of these things that people are putting in their you're putting in their foods, they will count towards one of your 5 a day as well. So don't be shy with your herbal portions in your cooking. And that, yes, everybody has an opportunity to find something they're familiar with. Like I say, a good foraging book or a foraging course. There's some really great, really kind of easy to follow herb and plant identification books, and just become familiar with a couple of things that are growing in your local environment. You know that they're clean and accessible, particularly if they're growing in your garden. Then yeah, just to start incorporating them, and the more you use them, the easier it becomes. We all probably have a herbal tea packet in our cupboard as well. If we walk into the co-op or into our sort of our local grocers, there will be a whole array of different herbal teas. So that's a great way for people to get started as well. Find a tea that really works and is really palatable for you, and then look at the ingredients. And then it's much more cost effective to go out and buy the raw ingredients from a good herbalist suppliers, and make it up yourself. And then you can tweak it to how it tastes for you, and really, really enjoy that connection with the plants, because they're beautiful as well. This is one of the lovely things. People often sort of think that they are just sort of, well, yes, I mean, sometimes they can be just kind of like, jars of green plant matter. But most of them are particularly beautiful. The roses, the camomiles and the flowers, particularly. They smell wonderful, they look beautiful, and they taste fantastic as well. So yeah, just have a play with them. This is the thing. Plants, because they're accessible to us, flowers as well, particularly, you can't really go wrong. Just have a play with them. They're very playful beings themselves. So it's nice they're inviting you to play with them.
So one last question here. So when people cook with herbs nowadays, do they lose any of their medicinal properties by being cooked or roasted, or however they're being used in the recipe?
Well, yes, potentially. I mean, once we heat pretty much anything over 40 degrees, it will lose a portion of its efficacy. But we will still be getting a proportion of the benefits of it. Often this is why we put plants into tinctures and preserve them through an alcohol medium or a glycerin or something like that, because we're not having to heat the plant. When we make a tea, sometimes, it's better, if you're making a black tea, you want to scald your tea, so add your boiling water straight away. If you're making a herbal tea, just let the water rest for a couple of minutes, about a minute and a half, before you pour it over the plants. This will mean that the plants themselves, the plant matter, doesn't get scalded. And what it will do is it will release all the aromatics. So if you get a lid on your teapot as quickly as possible, it traps all the aromatics in there. And what the heat and the water are doing at that point is extracting all the water-soluble compounds in it. So if you're making a tea, you're still getting a lot of the benefits of it. If you're using it in cooking, because you're ingesting it, you're getting all the benefits of the fibre and the cellulose and all that sort of soluble fibre in the plant as well. So sometimes that is as beneficial as taking the plant in its raw form. Obviously, with some things, we definitely would want to cook them. So it's very, very helpful to do that. But people can, absolutely put them in cooking. That's what they're there for. This is one of the things that, we are quite lucky in our modern age to be able to walk into a shop and a supermarket and find a shelf full of lovely pre-prepared culinary herbs for us on offer there. So again, it's that thing of there's so many different tastes and textures and smells, and it starts, getting curious, I think is the word. I think curiosity is a good ability or good skill, building curiosity around plants as well, because they invite you on a journey once you start to sort of interact with them. And for most people, you know, we often have kind of our sort of classic sort of Italian herbs in our kitchen, but there are so many more different types out there as well. So yeah, just get curious and have a play and see what tastes, you know, and smells and beautiful aromatics are out there, and what appeal, and yeah, what they do for you. Everybody knows the effects of chili.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Jaye. It's been really, really interesting, and I hope it inspires people to look a bit more closely at those herb jars in their kitchen cupboards, at least.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.